All right. Welcome to week 6, everybody. As amazing as that sounds, it is week 6. Um, Today's lesson is on the Roaring Twenties, and I'm briefly going to talk a little bit about politics during the Roaring Twenties because there's a very distinct shift, a very distinct change that happens from politics during the Progressive Era to politics during the Roaring Twenties. And for that reason, it makes the Roaring Twenties sort of like, for lack of a better term, actually it's kind of appropriate. The Roaring Twenties is like a bubble between the end of the Progressive Era and the Great Depression era. So first, I want to look at the politics of the thing, give you a little context, and then I want to talk a little bit about some culture in the 1920s, and I'm going to introduce you to a few characters and individuals and significant developments in American society. So the Roaring Twenties, at the end of World War One, 1918, 1919, it was a very dark time. You had the Black Sox baseball scandal. You had a horrible flu pandemic. Um, you had, of course, the end of the war, but of course, many casualties from the war. You had labor disputes. There was a massive steel strike in 1919 in the Chicago area that resulted in instances of race warfare. And so it was a really, really dark time, 1918, 1919. You had Americans jailed for, of course, you guys remember reading about Debs. He was, one of many who were tried under the Sedition Acts. So you had controls to free speech. You had a Red Scare. And it was a very bleak time. And in a lot of ways, the Roaring Twenties were like a psychological reaction to that. That the United States had come out of the war period there and kind of broke out, and consumer culture just seemed to boom. It seemed as though everybody, particularly in the cities, sought out enjoyment and kind of a living free mentality. People had fun, they drank, they gambled, despite prohibition. Um, it was kind of a time in which people, for lack of a better way of saying it, let their hair down. Um, it was also a time in which we left for a brief period of time. The United States kind of left the model of the progressive era in terms of government and reform, and instead of Roosevelt or Taft or Wilson, who had very much sought to use government to reform business um, in the best interest of society, to control and regulate business, the 1920s was a period in which you had three consecutive Republican presidents who all believed in more of a hands-off approach. They believed in what we might call laissez-faire um, capitalism, and they believed in a much more hands-off approach. And to some extent, that in the 1920s it was maybe perfect for that particular decade, as things very much seemed to boom in the 1920s. But the hands-off government approach was also a culprit of the Depression, as a lack of regulation of the banks and the stock markets and things like this, of farm and home loans. It was very much a culprit of the Depression, and that was symptomatic of the political and governmental attitude of the time as well. So the 1920s is kind of like a return to business conservatism that looks a little bit more like what you might have seen in the Gilded Age, which was the period just before the Progressive era. Presidents believed that their job was to maintain the smooth operation of business, and that it wasn't really the role of the executive branch to take measures, if you will, to try to reform and improve society for the masses. Traditional conservative presidents of the Gilded Age, as of the 1920s, very much believed this. More of a hands-off approach to kind of allow economic forces to control things. And of course, that is what the Progressive era was a reaction to. And the Progressive era tried to do the opposite. The Progressives tried to purposely, intentionally use government to create reform and improve society for the most. That was the fundamental basis of their idea. And so in a lot of ways, the 1920s politics of the 1920s was a reaction to progressives who sought to control business and control economics, and instead it was a change to a more hands-off approach and an appeal to what Herbert Hoover, who was the last of the three progressive presidents in the 1920s, called a rugged individualism. And right here, you're looking, of course, at Warren G. Harding. And Harding was the first president after Wilson. So you had Harding, you had Coolidge, and you had Hoover. And we'll talk more about Hoover when we do the lesson on the Depression. But Warren G. Harding was, he was a real politician's politician, and he was known to be having fun, carousing, and drinking, despite the period of Prohibition. So the 1920s was really a revolt from the progressive era. The presidents of the 1920s very much disagreed with the method of the progressive presidents, whether Republican or Democrat. The progressive presidents, of course, were Roosevelt, Taft, and Wilson, two Republicans and one Democrat. During the 1920s, there's a movement really to revolt from progressive principles, and in many respects, the presidents of the 20s, Warren G. Harding, Calvin Coolidge, and Herbert Hoover, sought to effectively repeal the changes of the progressive era. One of the ways that they do this is, in part, one is putting people in power who share your interests. So an example of this would be if you have an agency that's in place, you staff it with people who hold your same values. And so the Secretary of Interior is a great example. Warren G. Harding appointed to be his Secretary of Interior Albert Fall. Well, the Secretary of Interior's fundamental job during the progressive period was as an agency for conservation. Albert Fall was an anti-conservationist. So here you had an individual being appointed to the Secretary of Interior who didn't share the fundamental viewpoint of those who had shared it before him, being anti-conservationist. So that's one way you revolt from the progressive programs of those before you. Secretary of Treasury Mellon was one of the richest people in the country, and he had a lot of friends in high places, and he pushed through with these administrations a large tax cut on the wealthiest. During World War I, the United States had begun the first income tax, and the income tax was quite high on the rich. There wasn't an income tax on wage earners at this time. There wasn't a wage tax per se, like you might think about it today, and the income tax really was only exacted on several thousand of the wealthiest people in the country. But the administration substantially cut taxes for the rich. Now, in one respect, the Warren G. Harding administration and the Calvin Coolidge administration under Mellon did succeed in lowering the deficit. So the deficit was lowered. However, cutting taxes for the wealthy also played into the hands of big business and the wealthiest individuals, and it by far benefited the wealthy more than it did the middle class. So by and large, these changes really helped the richest people in the country, but did not really, in a meaningful way, benefit lower class or middle class people nearly as significantly. One other way you overturn progressive programs is by having the opportunity to appoint a lot of Supreme Court justices. Warren G. Harding was able to load the Supreme Court with 4 out of 9 justices, which is a lot of appointments. And of course, this Supreme Court became a big challenge for Franklin Delano Roosevelt during his New Deal program, as there were many justices that were appointed by Harding and thereby disagreed with some of the approaches used by Roosevelt during the New Deal. The Supreme Court during this period put down child labor laws. It also put down minimum wage laws for women. There was a law passed that provided a minimum wage for women workers, and this was overturned following suffrage, with the argument being that, well, now that you're effectively an equal citizen, you don't get a minimum wage law. So child labor laws were put down, minimum wage laws for women were put down, and probably most significant in the grand scheme of things, antitrust laws were ignored. The Interstate Commerce Commission, which is primarily responsible for overseeing antitrust violations, was manned with those sympathetic to railroad trusts, those sympathetic to the interests of big business. In fact, in some cases, trusts like the Cement Trust were formally encouraged by presidents like Herbert Hoover. And so the way you revolt from progressivism is you kind of do the opposite. And the way you do the opposite is by influencing laws through the Supreme Court, by changing the tax code that was put in place, by appointing people in your interests who will either ignore antitrust laws or will ignore laws with respect to conservationist policies and these types of things. Hardings Administration, going to what I just mentioned about the fact that it was kind of a well-known fact that Warren G. Harding had liquor at the White House, for example. Harding's presidency was associated with scandal, not just trying to get around Prohibition himself, but because, of course, the 1920s Prohibition is not repealed until Franklin Delano Roosevelt is inaugurated in 1933. And so the 1920s was embodied really by Prohibition. But Harding was a politician's politician, meaning he was a guy who liked the nightlife and he liked to enjoy himself, and he used such opportunities to build political support. But his administration was like Ulysses S. Grant's of the Gilded Age. It was very corrupt. And we can't really say exactly how much Warren G. Harding was exactly directly connected to corruption, but the administration was riddled by corruption, and particularly as depicted here in this political cartoon, the Teapot Dome scandal, which Teapot Dome remains probably in the top 3 for political scandals for the United States during the 20th century. This was a case in which the Secretary of the Interior, Albert Fall, had basically taken a bribe of $100,000 from some Wall Street guys to some businessmen who were basically trying to use the oil reserves in Wyoming and in California, the Teapot Dome reserves, and they were going to use these reserves for personal profit. They were naval oil reserves, and so they were basically they were not something that Albert Fall had a right to do. And this was a huge scandal, and Albert Fall was actually tried and sentenced for this, but he took a bribe, as the court found, and the scandal was that basically the government wasn't regulating the control of oil reserves in the country adequately. So here you see the image before you of Calvin Coolidge. They called him Silent Cal. And Silent Cal, as I'll call him, was he was known for being a just a very kind of, for lack of a better term, kind of a cold fish. He didn't have a lot of personality. There's a story about Calvin Coolidge where Calvin Coolidge is sitting down and they're eating, and the lady across from him says something to the effect of, you know, I'm willing to bet that I'm going to be able to get more than 2 words out of you tonight. And his response to her was, "You're wrong." So he had a tendency to be kind of a rather non-charismatic person. But he really promoted, and I'm putting these 2 theories of economics up in front of you. They're just basic theories here that I want you to note, because this is really the argument that starts to happen in the 20s and the 30s, was the argument between trickle-down economics and Keynesian economics. And it was really embodied the argument that Hoover and FDR would have. But Calvin Coolidge and Warren G. Harding and Herbert Hoover, the presidents of the 20s, very much promoted a trickle-down economic approach, which was basically the idea that if government lowers taxes on the biggest businesses, that the businesses are the ones that create the jobs. And if you deregulate and you lower taxes and you make things cheaper for business, then business hires more people. That's the kind of the idea. Herbert Hoover believed in voluntarism. He believed that big businesses could help out when they volunteered to help out, but that it wasn't the role of the federal government to determine how much they should pay their workers, or how long the work hours should be, and these types of things. And so they were generally non-regulatory. They didn't believe in regulatory policies, and to a large degree, you can argue that such policies didn't necessarily cause the catastrophe of the Depression, but you could argue very much that those policies, once the Depression happens in 1929 and many, many people lose their jobs, once you're in that situation, the people were turning to the government to do something. And when the government didn't, the kind of idea that the government shouldn't do anything, even in a time of crisis, was seen as problematic. And by contrast, the other theory, Keynesian economics, which by and large embodies U.S. economic policy since Franklin Delano Roosevelt until present, it was really, the founder was a guy named John Maynard Keynes. He was a British economist. And it's basically the idea of using controlled inflationary spending to promote economic growth and economic activity. So FDR's New Deal was based on this. And so while Herbert Hoover said, well, you have to let the market take care of itself, this is once the Depression had begun, getting ahead of ourselves a little bit. But Hoover would respond to the Depression by saying, you have to let things take care of itself, and businesses can volunteer to help, but it's not the job of the government. And FDR's response was basically that no, the government can effectively take controlled inflationary policies to create jobs and to stimulate the economy. So this is a very fundamental kind of argument in American economics that continues till this day. And so I wanted to make sure before we even got to the Depression that you guys would have this in the back of your mind, because this is really what's forming the idea behind the 20s and then Keynesian economics in the 1930s. So in the 1920s, you had a lot of things on the surface that seemed great. It seemed the economy was booming in the United States. We had tremendous, we became relatively well off compared to European powers following the First World War. But there were a lot of, despite the kind of, there's a sexual revolution in the country. I mean, you have the birth of film. You have the birth of spectator sports effectively on another scale. And so the country's booming. There's new gadgets. People are driving cars. It's definitely a boom time in the United States. People are also making it and losing it on the stock market. But there are problems behind the scene, and these problems lead to the Depression. One, the stock market and the banks, in terms of how they use the market and how they act in the market, were completely unregulated. And there were a lot of people who were undertaking margin bidding, which for a layperson like myself, to make it really simple, margin bidding is basically the idea of committing yourself to an entire stock, but only paying for 10% of it up front and effectively having the rest of it on loan effectively. And so the idea behind that was, you could go into the stock market and you might be behind initially, but when your stocks came through, you would make the payoff and you would make money. Of course, what happens is when banks fail, which they're connected to farm and home loan issues as well at this time, when you have issues in the market and you have a tremendous amount of bank failures, or you have a lot of recalls of loans, then what happens is there's nothing to regulate this and prevent the bottom from dropping out, which is what happened. So you had a lot of debt out there, and a lot of debt that was very, very precarious. So you had inflated farm loans, which were very problematic, where farmers were basically, they had no choice but to pay what the loan was speculated at. But there was corruption within the speculation industry. The prices were put up very high, so loans were higher. So there's problems with farm and home loans. There's also a world economic crisis. The German economy was in total shambles. But when you go to the market and the banks and these types of things, you basically have a huge amount of debt in the market, in the system, that when lots of it cannot be actually followed through on, then what happens is the market crashes and banks close. They can't get their loans back, and so banks close and the market crashes. And this is what will happen. We'll talk more about this when we get to the Depression. But there's other tensions, too, relating to the development of World War II. Germany's in shambles, and the German people are, many of them, blaming the very unfair Versailles Peace Conference, peace treaty. So the Nazis are beginning to become a political movement in Germany. Also, the Washington Naval Conference of 1921 saw rising tensions between the United States and the Japanese, as basically what happened at the Washington Naval Conference. This was one of the real contributions of Warren G. Harding's administration to foreign relations, and this was the idea that the major powers of the world, Great Britain, the United States, Japan, they would agree to certain limitations on the size of their navy. And well, to make a long story short, the United States purposely intercepted the Japanese negotiators' transmissions during the conference. And so we used inside information to negotiate the Japanese down to accepting a smaller naval strength than the United States and Great Britain. And when Japan found out about that, they were very angry. And so you have a foreshadowing of tensions in the Pacific. When we get to World War II, you'll see that in a lot of respects, World War II was a case in which you had the United States and Japan, two empires, colliding against one another. And so you start to see some of these tensions develop in 1921. Now, I want to talk a little bit about culture in the 1920s. The 1920s it's the birth of movie stars in the 1920s. It's a sexual revolution, spectator sports, superstar athletes, organized crime and gangsters, a dance craze in the United States. It's a very interesting period in United States history, and a lot of times it's not really given full credit for just how revolutionary a period it was. So first thing, in the 1920s, the 1920s was on one side of things this kind of like boom time, great economics. There's so many things that, you have superstar athletes, you have people making it on the stock market, these types of things. But you also had incredible racism in the country. The United States government passed two anti-immigration acts in 1920 and 21. I think it's 1920 and 21, but it's the early 20s. And these anti-immigration acts were specifically designed to put quotas on migration from people from non-white areas. And so effectively how they did this ultimately is they said that they were basing the amount of immigrants from, say, the Philippines, just hypothetically, that they would accept as immigrants to the United States based on a percentage, I think it was 10% or 5% of the population of those people in 1890. And they purposely did that knowing that in 1890 there was far less quote-unquote non-white individuals. And so the quotas were directly designed to limit the migration of people from non-white areas. And immigration was so restricted in this period that by the beginning of the 1930s, there were actually more people leaving the United States than coming to the United States. There's also in 1920 a Red Scare, and the Attorney General Mitchell Palmer oversaw witch hunts against people that were deemed to be socialist or communist. There were members of state legislatures who had to give up their seats. There were teachers and professors who were fired for being allegedly socialist or communist, despite the fact that technically, in the United States, an individual has every right to accept different types of political ideologies. That's part of the freedom of thought and the freedom of expression that we have in the United States. There were also, there's a highly publicized trial and execution of Sacco and Vanzetti, the notorious anarchists who were put to death largely as a symbol of the United States' opposition to communism and anarchism, these movements in the world. And of course, also in the 1920s, you have the zenith of popularity of the Ku Klux Klan, which became wildly popular in the Midwest, particularly in places like Ohio and Indiana. And you'll see I'm going to put a little short document from Time from the 1920s, from 1925, and you'll see there's an interesting story in there about a woman who was not only a progressive and a strong advocate of temperance or prohibition, but also a member of the Klan, and received her burial with Klan honors. And so it's a very, like, the pallbearers of her burial were KKK members. And so it's a time of incredible xenophobia, fear of outsiders, and racism. Organized crime flourished during the 1920s, and the primary reason it flourished was really due, by and large, to the 18th Amendment. The 18th Amendment banned alcohol in the United States. It banned the sale or production, distribution of alcohol in the United States. And the result was that it provided an excellent avenue for gangsters to make money in the illegal industry. And the image you see here is an image from the infamous St. Valentine's Day massacre, in which Al Capone's gang, disguised as police officers, effectively executed members of a rival gang on Valentine's Day, 1929. Al Capone, pictured here, this is a picture of Al Capone in 1930, was, one of several, but he was really the ultimate gangster, and he made his money, like I said, primarily on, there's other things like prostitution and gambling and these types of things, but he made his money, his empire, more than anything else on booze, and this was because, of course, the prohibition of alcohol made it, that people had no other option but to tap the black market. And the black market, with Al Capone, he was in Chicago primarily. His alcohol came down from Canada by and large, and some of it was distilled illegally in the States. But he used to run shipping lines, illegal shipping lines down from Canada. There were other illegal, if you see at the bottom, you see rum runners. There were also these ships that would pick up alcohol from other places, rum from the Caribbean, and they would bring the alcohol up outside of New York City, where they were still in international waters. And there were these people who would go out on small craft, and they would go out to the big ships, and they would pick up the alcohol and illegally bring it into the city under the fog of night. Al Capone used to organize liquor bombings. They would bomb rival gangs' stash. And in many cases in Chicago at this time and in other cities, there was outright gang warfare as the mobsters vied for influence and control of various market areas. In many respects, gang wars, the gangs were as dangerous to themselves as were the police who were trying to shut them down. Now, at this time, you see speakeasies. In the cities, everybody was drinking. This is why Al Capone made a lot of money, because there was, and he would testify to this, that he would say, even though he's incredibly brutal, and he was also he was flamboyant. He was very known for the jewelry he would wear and the women he would carouse with. But he would say in interviews, he would say, I'm providing a service, basically, that people want. And people, particularly in cities, did want to drink. And people drank a lot, right up to the President Warren G. Harding. And a lot of the drinking occurred in places called speakeasies, which were illegal drinking establishments. They would sometimes they would have gambling in there too. And you would go to a speakeasy, and there was a certain method for entrance into the illegal operation. Just want to show you a picture. It's not actually, it's not just a fantasy of cartoons that the Thompson submachine gun here, or Tommy gun, it's pictured with the round circular magazine, which was the most, that becomes the most iconic look. But the Tommy gun, as it became known, which was a submachine gun, it was invented in 1918. It was used in World War II. but it became a favorite for gangsters. It's really one of the first efficient handheld small arms submachine guns. And of course, this is a little bit grainy, but of course, this is how, in some cases, you might meet a gangster moving his piece around, disassembled in a violin case. There's real things that these things did happen. And the Thompson submachine gun was a choice weapon of gangsters because of its caliber and its ability to discharge a lot of rounds. 1920s, you see the birth of film, obviously pictured here. Charlie Chaplin, and this is from one of his more famous silent films. Of course, the 1920s. Not until the late 20s do you actually see film becoming, audio films really arriving. Instead, it was primarily all silent films. There's some other great actors, not just Charlie Chaplin, but also Laurel and Hardy. Probably the greatest comic duo of all time, got their break in silent films, and then their biggest hits were in sound films in the the early 30s. Their biggest hits are particularly shorts like Them Thar Hills and The Music Box, which YouTube, those are up there. They're really funny, and they're not that long either. The 1920s is a period in which second wave feminism really it hits a peak. There's a strong women's movement in the United States. In the cities particularly, there were many women who were dubbed flappers who intentionally challenged and broke the sexual norms of society, of the sexual and societal norms, the gender norms, if you will, of society. And I want to make this comment that, human society is a construct. It's constantly changing, and people are the ones that are always changing it. And in one way or another, women like the one pictured here understood this. They understood that the gender norms of society, which of course were very, very repressive for women for quite some time, and well after the 20s, but they understood that these things could be changed. And of course they have been changed, and they're still changing. Ethics in society, gender norms, racial hierarchies, class systems, these are all constructs. They're all human creations. And so you look at the 1920s as a very racial period in which even progressive women were at times at the forefront of membership in groups like the KKK all over the country. But that society that is so based in racism is not based on anything. It's in flux, and so it can constantly be changed. And it was that element of society, the racism in the 1920s, that if you look at the last 100 years, the United States has really ultimately actively changed that, and is still changing that, and trying to create a more just and equal society. So I want you guys are like, wow, now he's talking about Babe Ruth. Well, you know what? Part of history is having people that you look up to, and people that you even make kind of legends in your mind. And Babe Ruth was always one for me. I'm a historian, and so my heroes have rarely been from my generation. And Babe Ruth was always one for me. But it's an important lesson to remember that you can look at an individual and a character from a time period and use that character to speak for the era in general. And that's what I'm going to show you here. So Babe Ruth, there's two reasons why you study Babe Ruth. The first reason, Ruth in the 1920s obviously transformed the game of baseball. So we have baseball reasons. Like, he was the ultimate player. I mean, when he did what he did, nobody else was doing it. When he broke the home run record the first time in 1919, he hit more home runs than any other team in the entirety of the game. And so for baseball reasons, he single-handedly revolutionized the game of baseball, which is an incredible contribution if you happen to like baseball. However, there's another reason, and that is that Ruth is a lens into the 1920s. Okay? Ruth he embodies the era. And in a lot of ways, Ruth could be, the time period could be called the Age of Ruth. he was probably the most ubiquitous American character in the 1920s. And understanding Ruth helps us really understand this era. So, a few statistics. I won't linger on this stuff too long. He was a pitcher first with the Red Sox. He actually almost won, over 5 seasons, he won almost 100 games as a pitcher. And he actually pitched in the World Series. He pitched 29 scoreless innings as a starting pitcher, which still today is, I think, second all time behind Whitey Ford. So he was an incredible pitcher. He was sold to the Yankees from the Red Sox. And of course, that began the famous Yankees-Red Sox rivalry. However, another thing that's important to remember about this is that, you know, New York is where you go to make it big. And so you have to remember that one of the reasons he becomes a superstar is because he's in New York City. And New York City is the one place in the United States that every single person in America would have some awareness of. In a lot of ways, Babe Ruth saved baseball, and he also, in a way, helped America psychologically. You know, in the post-war period with the flu pandemic, the Black Sox, labor strikes, the Red Scare, people have died in war. It was a dark time, and it was at this time that Babe Ruth kind of stepped into the void left by the Black Sox. And, you know, baseball was America's game at this time. It was something that, it was the sport that Americans were most aware of. And so in that respect, Babe Ruth was kind of a psychological boost for the country. So Ruth embodies the Roaring Twenties. He's one of these characters you can really think about, and you can really say, you know, George Herman Ruth, the Bambino, he really embodies the 1920s. He had a character that, you know, it was live big and live like you're going to hit a home run every day. And that's why Babe Ruth was this character who could seemingly conquer all. He could seemingly do everything. He had huge appetites. He would go out in the town in fancy cars with women. He would drink lots at night. He would wake up with a hangover, miss batting practice, and then he would make it to the game and go 4 for 4. He was a guy who kind of had all his chips all in all the time, it seemed like. He also, you know, you look at Ruth, you know, in the Roaring Twenties, he's like, obviously he's not he's not an example for organized crime, but, you know, he would have frequented speakeasies. He would have been with many women that you would call flappers, women who were, you know, living a new way in the 1920s. And Ruth was part of this lifestyle. He was kind of at the epicenter of this lifestyle. I would also say, too, that, you know, and this is a little bit more of a stretch, but when you look at the politics of the 1920s, politics was to kind of let business and economics run its course, and the result was an incredible economic boom and bust that ultimately resulted from deregulation and led to more regulation. In some cases, the 1920s as a bubble time, a boom time, bursting with energy and excitement. You know, in a lot of ways, you know, Ruth embodied that essence. I'm sorry, that's not exactly right there, but, you know, interestingly, Ruth's career followed a similar path. He lived a kind of lifestyle that was for the moment and created tremendous growth and incredible things in that period, but it didn't create longevity for his health. So a couple of, and I won't show you these too much longer, but something that I find interesting, and I really encourage you guys to find historical figures that mean something to you. And I have many, many ones, but in the 1920s, I like to talk about Ruth. He had a lot of incredible, phenomenal numbers that he did, and he was an athlete that became a myth. He became a legend, and I often wonder if, you know, one of the reasons was because it was a time period in which there was no TV. The most people who had an idea of Babe Ruth in their head, same with Ted Williams or Joe DiMaggio or Mickey Mantle, these people, the image was created largely by radio announcers. Most people didn't get to go to games. Most people heard a game on the radio, and maybe they got to see a game one time in their life. And so you had mythic kind of heroes created during this time period. And Ruth was, by the way, just to refute one myth, Ruth was actually a tremendous athlete. He doesn't become kind of the bigger, sort of overweight player until really close to the end. And if you look at these pictures, it really shows, you know, just tremendous athlete that he was. Just a few numbers, of course, famously hitting 60 homers in the World Series. Hitting 60 homers in 1927, the year they won the World Series. I'm not going to, you know, kind of torture you with these statistics. I'm just, you know, I would never ask you a test question about a Babe Ruth statistic, but just to give you a look at an image of really the original superstar and the infatuation of America in the 1920s was right there, was Babe Ruth. Ruth became a myth, and it's a myth that embodies what the 1920s was all about. Living big, somehow doing what others imagined could never have been possible. Ruth really embodied that, and you know, he also had a character to him that was not shy, but was upfront, and for this reason, he was really born as the most iconic baseball player ever. Even still today, you know, you would venture to say that the vast majority of people who are interested in baseball know exactly who Babe Ruth was. So, just the last slide I want to leave you guys with here. I hope you guys don't think I'm just running my mouth about Babe Ruth too much. But I want to just convey that, you know, Ruth is a character who really embodies the 20s. He's an example of an individual that you can look at and study, and as a character, he tells you a lot about the era. And I mean, if you look at baseball, of course, baseball was segregated in the 1920s too, and so even through the lens of baseball in the 1920s, you can understand problems with race, but you can also understand attitudes in terms of lifestyle during the 20s as well. And so, you know, Babe Ruth was always kind of like a hero for me as a kid from the earliest day when my dad took me to the baseball field for the first time. I played baseball was the first game that I learned, and I was taught very early on that Babe Ruth was the greatest of all baseball players. And, you know, that had never been a question in my mind. It was never a question that I had to literally see, you know, somebody who, you know, who was an incredibly historically important figure for me. So I would say, you know, in your own life, I highly recommend, you know, find characters that you can study and learn about, and you use those characters to as a lens to greater explain and greater understand a time period. And it's fun and it's interesting, and it's just one way of approaching history that you know, I definitely encourage. So hopefully this was helpful. If you want to see any of his career stats, which are all pretty impressive, those are just his batting stats, of course. They're right there. But anyway, I hope this was a helpful presentation.